All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Introduction to the Bible. This is week number 4, so we're getting close to the end. This is actually probably my favorite week of the 5, so we got a lot of cool stuff to talk about tonight. A couple of reminders before we get into stuff. First of all, if you want the handouts that we're using, you can go to the church website, fcctuscola.com. Click on Introduction to the Bible, and then you can download them. There's only one handout this week, so it just says week 4 handout. So you can download that there. And then if you're on any of the live streaming platforms, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or online.church, all 3 of them have a live chat. So if you have any questions, just go ahead and type your question in the live chat, and I'll hopefully be able to get to it as time permits. But we have a lot of cool stuff to go through tonight, so we're gonna go ahead and do that. So let's pray, and we'll get started. So God, we love you, and we thank you for your word and how good you are, and how we can see that in the midst of all the things that your word teaches us. We thank you that you are in control, and we love you and we praise you. It's in Christ's name I pray. Amen. All right, so here's something weird. I've got my laptop here so that I can keep on top of the live chats, and I hadn't turned the sound off, so I heard myself talking while I was praying. That was kind of weird. All right, so tonight we're going to talk about Jesus. We've been going through the stages of the story of the Bible. We did the structure the first week, and we've been doing the stages of the story ever since. And the first one was the patriarchs. Last week was the nation of Israel, and this week is Jesus. And even though this is the shortest period as far as how many years we're going to cover, this is definitely where the most stuff is. And so we're going to definitely kind of have a bird's eye view of what we're going over tonight. But we're going to start by looking at some history and some stuff that was going on actually between the Old and the New Testament. And you might be like, this is Introduction to the Bible. Why do we have to look at all this stuff that's not even in the Bible, that's going on in the world? It's really important. And this is actually really cool, the stuff that we're about to look at. So we know from a couple weeks ago that sin came into the world when Adam and Eve chose to sin, and we're all guilty of choosing to do things that we know we're not supposed to do. And God has had a plan in motion since the very beginning to bring Jesus into the world to be the sacrifice for that sin of ours. And it's going to come through Abraham, and we learned it's going to come through David. And now tonight, it's going to happen. God is going to be on the planet. Jesus is going to come. But God is not just doing this at random. And I want to read a verse from the book of Galatians. This is a New Testament letter that's written by Paul, who we'll talk about next week. But Paul is talking about when Jesus came, because he would have written this after Jesus. And he says this interesting phrase here. So he says, the heir is subject to guardians and trustees, and the time set by his father. So also, when we were underage, we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. It just means we were in our sin. We were caught in our sin. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. When the set time had fully come, the time when Jesus came to the earth was no coincidence. It was no accident. And so we're going to kind of see the stuff that prepared the way for the Messiah, Jesus, to come into the earth. Now, before we get into that too much, I want to talk about the word Messiah just a little bit. Because you might not be super familiar with that, and we have a lot of songs that we sing in church that talk about the Messiah, and you might be like, what's a Messiah? So basically, the Messiah, it means anointed one, and it's somebody that was going to come from God, that was going to deliver the people and bring them freedom, essentially. And so we have verses like Isaiah 61 that say, he has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners. And so this Messiah is going to be coming from God, is actually going to be God, and he's going to come bring freedom. And what that freedom is going to look like is going to be different than what they're anticipating, but that's what the Messiah is going to do. So, preparation for the Messiah, and this is really exciting stuff. So everybody buckle up and get ready for this. If you need to go to the bathroom, now would be a good time. Okay, now you're out of time, so we're going to start. Preparation for the Messiah. We're going to start with a map. So last week we talked about how the nation of Israel was in the Promised Land, and through the combined idiocy of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, the nation split into half, or not half, but into two parts. So we have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, eventually, the northern kingdom is going to go off into exile by Assyria, and they're going to come back and kind of somewhat resettle the land, but some of them are going to be Israelites, some of them are going to be Assyrians, and they're going to wind up being this sort of mixture that eventually is called the Samaritans. And the southern kingdom is going to go off to exile in Babylon, and that's where we get books like Daniel, and Ezekiel talks about that, and Jeremiah. But eventually, after 7 years in exile, we're going to get what's called the Persian period. Now, the Persian period is basically called that because the Persians conquer Babylon. So the Israelites are in captivity in Babylon, but Babylon gets captured by the Persians. And the Persians, led by Cyrus, say, hey, you can go home. You can go home. And so the Jews get to go home, back to Jerusalem. They rebuild the temple. They rebuild the city walls. But not everybody goes. Some of the Jews stay back in what was Babylon, in the Persian Empire, and that's where we see the Esther story taking place. She's a Jew, but she's back in the Persian Empire, and so some people stayed, some people went part of the way and not all the way. And so the first step that we have in preparation for the Messiah is called the dispersion of the Jews. And if you're around a nerdy Bible person, they may refer to it as the Jewish diaspora. Literally, all this means is that Jews are scattered and spread out now. They're not like in this one place where the Jews would be. They're like all over. And so now, instead of having them concentrated kind of in one place, we've got people who are teaching who God is and how to live for him and what his ways are all over the place. And so that's kind of the first step that's doing this. Now, eventually, a guy is going to come along that we know as Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great, if you're not familiar with him from history, an insane warrior, conquered the world at a very young age, but did not destroy Jerusalem, interestingly enough. Now, the mission that Alexander had was to make the entire world what we would call Hellenized, and basically that just means he wanted everyone in the world to adopt Greek culture. And so anything that was Greek culture, he wanted the whole world doing, and because of his very successful conquests, his spread of Greek culture was also highly successful. And so the next thing that we have going is called the common language. And what this means is that the Bible had been written in Hebrew and a little Aramaic. So because all we have right now is the Old Testament. But it's not referred to as the Old Testament, it's just the Scriptures, because the New Testament hasn't even happened yet. And so that's written in Hebrew and a little Aramaic, but now, with everyone speaking Greek, there seems to be this need for a translation. And so the Greek translation of the Old Testament is made. It's called the Septuagint, which is just a fancy word for 70 because there were supposedly 70 scribes that worked on it. But now we have a Greek Bible. And this is huge because with Alexander pushing Greek culture, now people speak Greek all over the place. And so now we have Jews all over the place. We have Greek speaking all over the place. And we have a Greek Bible that they can read and learn about God from. So eventually, Alexander's two sons take over, Seleucid and Ptolemy, and their descendants, eventually a guy comes along to rule by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. And Antiochus Epiphanes was an awful dude that did a lot of awful stuff, and a lot of it was to the Jews. And he desecrated the temple, and it was a pretty nasty situation. We read about this in the book of 1 Maccabees. Now, there's a revolt that is led against against Antiochus Epiphanes by a guy named Judas Maccabeus, and it's successful. And they are able to take back the temple, and it takes them 8 days to reconsecrate it and rededicate it, and that's what Hanukkah celebrates. And so we're under this rule, and eventually we take it back, and then eventually the Romans come in and capture Jerusalem in 63 AD. And so if we're the Jews, we've been led or ruled, or whatever you want to say, by the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians and the Seleucids and now the Romans. No one is alive by the time the first century comes. No one is alive in Jerusalem that remembers a time when they weren't being ruled by somebody. Well, you remember the Messiah was supposed to come along and bring them freedom, and they were ready for it. And so the third thing preparing for the Messiah was a longing for freedom. There was a desire for the Messiah to come because we're so tired of living under other people. And supposedly the Messiah is going to come, he's going to knock the Romans down, and he's going to lead us back to our freedom. Now, something interesting that happened during the Roman period was the Romans began building roads. And it's weird nowadays to think about there not being roads everywhere, but roads were kind of a big invention for maybe not necessarily invention, but innovation maybe for the Romans. And we've got a picture here of kind of how their roads were put together, and you can see there's a foundation, and then a couple of other layers, and then they paved over the top of that. So these were pretty high quality roads. And I've got a couple pictures of roads that were built in that time period that are actually still in use today. You can see there's one here that, I mean, it's not obviously perfect, but it considering how old it is, it's held up pretty well. And then there's another one that's mentioned in Acts 28. That road is, again, still in use. And so the Romans were not just making roads, they were making high quality, really travelable roads. And this was a huge deal because now travel to places that had been not so easy to get to is now much easier. And so the last thing in preparation for the Messiah, the ability to travel in new ways. So here we are in history. We've got Jews and people who know who God is all over the place. They're all speaking the same language, and there's a Bible in that language. Everybody is excited for the concept of freedom. Everybody is longing for the Messiah to come. It's a big deal culturally. And now we have the ability to travel to places that we've never been able to travel before. This is the perfect recipe for something like this to happen. And right in the midst of all of it, Jesus comes. Okay, this was no accident. And it's going to explode and take over the world because God knew exactly what he was doing and how he was putting this all together. And so Jesus is going to come, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight is Jesus' life as recorded in the four Gospels. So let's go on to the four Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and Luke are the only ones that record anything about Jesus' childhood, which is insane because it's Jesus. Comedian Mark Lowry once said, "Good night, God's in the house isn't someone keeping a journal." Like, no one felt the need to write down what's going on with Jesus as a kid. But these are the four Gospels that we have, and just a little bit of background for Matthew and Luke as far as being young. So we're going to look at some phases of Jesus' life, and we're going to spend a ton of time on this. This is more the kind of stuff that Les is doing in his class, but just this first one I do want to look at. So birth and preparation. So this is Christmas stuff. The angels announce that Jesus is coming and so forth and so on. So we have the announcements. We have the birth in Bethlehem, which, obviously we see acted out every Christmas. And then you'll note growth. Jesus in the temple. There's a story about Jesus when he's 12 that he goes missing and his parents can't find him. And when they finally find him, he's in the temple talking to the religious leaders and asking questions and sharing his wisdom even at a 12-year-old. And his parents are like, "What are you doing? Why are you in here?" And he's like, "Why would I be anywhere else?" So we have this kind of interesting story about Jesus. And then we have the summary of Jesus' childhood. Now you'll note that's not a typo. Luke 2:51 through 52, 2 verses summing up Jesus' entire childhood. And basically it says Jesus grew up and did well. Well, thanks. So not a lot on Jesus' childhood. When we pick up with Jesus, we're going to spend most of our time with him as an adult. And so the next phases of Jesus' life, and this again is not something we're going to go into a lot because this is more or less Les's class, but first 2 years of ministry and the places he's going, and then the third year of ministry, he's got the 12 apostles and his ministry around Judea, and then his last week in Jerusalem. There is so much that happens in the last week of Jesus' life. I took a class in grad school that was called Passion Narrative, and it was about the last week of Jesus' life. And I remember it was a semester class, and I remember thinking there is no way that we're going to spend an entire semester on 1 week of Jesus' life. And when the class was over, there was so much that we hadn't even gotten to, because it's unreal how much really important and awesome stuff happens in the last week of Jesus' life. So the climax, this is where we're going to spend kind of the majority of our time tonight. So Jesus came, while he came to do a lot of things, his main priority, he came to die and to be our sacrifice. And so his crucifixion, his resurrection, coming back from the dead, and then the things that happen while he's on earth after being raised from the dead, and then his ascension when he goes back to heaven. So that's kind of where we're going to be for most of tonight. So the 12 apostles, you may have heard about Jesus' 12 apostles. These are who he was training and teaching to essentially be the leaders of the church when it starts after he goes back to heaven, and that's what we'll be talking about next week. Some interesting names. Some of these names might be somewhat familiar because we hear more about them. Some of them we don't hear much of anything about. But the first three, Peter, James, and John, now there were 2 Jameses, and so they're usually identified by who their dad was. And this is James, the son of Zebedee, and John is his brother, so they're both the sons of Zebedee. Peter, James, and John are kind of like Jesus's inner circle. Like if Jesus goes somewhere and only takes 3 of them, it's usually these 3. So Peter, James, and John, and then Andrew is Peter's brother, and Philip. Philip has a couple of interesting stories in the book of Acts, but then Bartholomew, not a lot of mentions of him. Matthew is, of course, who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. He's a tax collector. Thomas is most well known for being unsure that Jesus actually rose from the dead. When they told him Jesus rose from the dead, it's true. He won't believe it until he actually sees the holes in his hands, and so that's unfortunately kind of what he's remembered for. If you've ever heard the phrase doubting Thomas, that's where it comes from. So we have another James, the son of Alphaeus, we have Thaddeus, we have Simon the Zealot, and then of course we have Judas Iscariot, whose unfortunate legacy is having betrayed Jesus. And so those are the 12 apostles. So Jesus, while he's on earth, there is so much stuff for us to go over that it's not even possible. So we're just going to kind of touch on some of the really, 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 really big things. And one of those is that Jesus performed quite a few miracles while he was on the earth. And the first one we're going to look at is healing. Now, Jesus healed a lot of people. And we don't have records for every single person that Jesus healed. We have situations where it says that people brought they're sick to Jesus and they're injured to Jesus, and he would heal them, and he healed all of them, and sometimes that's all we're told. But we do have several sort of specific examples. Man with leprosy, Roman centurion's servant, Peter's mother-in-law, which is interesting because that tells us Peter had a wife, which kind of gives a little interesting context to some of the stuff going on. Paralyzed man, woman with bleeding, 2 blind men, mute demon-possessed man. There was several healings of demon possession. Going on to the next one, Canaanite woman's daughter, a boy with a demon, 2 blind men. You can kind of see there's a lot of blindness and muteness and demon possession. These are the kind of things that they were struggling with at that time. The last person on the slide is man born blind. And this guy, even though he's only in one chapter of the Bible, is one of my favorite characters. He's hilarious. He's in John chapter 9. And basically, he's being interviewed after being healed by Jesus by the religious leaders who don't really like Jesus and are trying to figure out what's going on. And he should be, they think, giving them all sorts of respect for being the, big deal religious leaders they are. And he doesn't do that. Like at one point they're asking about Jesus and he's like, "Oh, do you want to become his followers too?" Like he's hilarious. And unfortunately we never learn his name. He's just the man born blind. But miracles of healing, the next type of miracles we want to look at, miracles of Jesus over nature. Jesus does several things that you're not supposed to be able to do, that people don't have the ability to do. Things like calming the storm. Jesus tells the storm on the sea to be quiet, and it literally does what he says. Like, that's insane. Walking on water, feeding 5,000 people and 4,000 people with just a little tiny bit of food, grabbing a fish and pulling a coin out, withering a fig tree just by telling it to wither, large miraculous catches of fish, water turned into wine, and it does the fish catching thing again. I think because usually if you read timelines about Jesus' life, I think that Jesus' first miracle is not that he turned water into wine, which is what people normally say. I think it's that Jesus was a sinless teenager. But that's a different thing altogether. So, miracles of Jesus over nature. Now, one of the things that we want to kind of be aware of with regard to his miracles over nature is that everyone's reaction when he does this stuff is exactly what it should be. So when we read fairy tales and stories where people do, crazy things and things that, people don't normally have the ability to do, the response is usually, fairly normal from people because they're taking place in a world where it's a made-up world where this stuff just kind of happens. But that's not how Jesus' miracles are received. Everyone freaks out at the stuff that he does. Like, holy cow, is he really doing this? And that says a lot because we have a tendency to read stories like this and think, well, those people just weren't enlightened enough like we are to know that a person can't just talk to a storm and tell it to be quiet, and it'll listen. We know that that's not possible. Well, guess what? They freaked out because they knew that wasn't possible too. And so when Jesus calms the storm or walks on the water or magically heals people or does any of this crazy stuff, like, people freaked out because they knew that's not supposed to happen. You're not supposed to be able to do this. And so Jesus is obviously, whatever's going on with him is a big deal, because he can do this stuff that's not supposed to be able to be done. The last miracles of Jesus, raising the dead, this obviously doesn't include raising himself from the dead, which is a pretty good miracle too. But he raises 3 people from the dead: Jairus' daughter, the widow's son, and then Lazarus. And Lazarus is a really, really special story, because it's a very large turning point in the road Jesus is walking to his crucifixion. So the story of Lazarus, Lazarus and his sisters Mary and Martha, they are friends with Jesus. Jesus was a human like anybody else, and while he loved everybody, obviously some people liked him more than others, and he did have friends. And Mary and Martha and Lazarus are his friends. And Jesus is gone, and Lazarus gets really, really, really sick. And, you know, this is kind of an interesting situation they're in, because Jesus has been going around healing all sorts of people. And now his good friend is sick. So surely at this point, Jesus is going to come and heal his friend, but he doesn't. He doesn't come right away. He waits, and Lazarus dies. And by the time Jesus gets there, Lazarus has been dead for a few days. He's in the tomb and wrapped up, and when Jesus shows up, they say, you know, why didn't you come? Why didn't you respond? Like, if you had been here when he was sick, you could have healed him and he wouldn't have died. Where were you? And Jesus basically says, I'm gonna bring him back, and he calls for them to open the door to the tomb, and they say he's been dead long enough that, like, he's definitely dead. It's gonna be smelly in there. The King James Version says, Lord, he stinketh. What do we, like, it's too late. But they open the gate, or open the door to the tomb, and sure enough, Jesus calls out to Lazarus, and Lazarus walks back out. And this is just insane. And it's got everyone in an uproar, because if there's anything that you're not able to do, it's tell somebody that's dead to come back to life, and they can do it. And this is clearly not something that's staged. It's not something that is, pre-planned or faked, because Lazarus is dead. He's been in the tomb for days, and, like, he's definitely dead, but now he's definitely alive. This is crazy. And everybody gets into an uproar about all of this. And so John 11:46 through 53 tells us that the religious leaders who didn't like Jesus and were struggling with Jesus anyway get together at this point, and after the whole Lazarus thing, they basically say, this is out of hand, and this has got to stop. This guy needs to go away one way or another. And so Jesus kind of nudges the whole thing about him dying along in this healing of Lazarus, and that's why he does it very carefully. Yeah, there has to be certainty that Lazarus is dead, and that this is what really is happening, so that the uproar is big enough that it causes the commotion he needs it to, and it does. And so the next thing that we're going to jump to is in the last week of Jesus' life. So the plot to kill him is in place. Okay, the religious leaders that don't like him, they're ready, and they're getting ready to put their plan into action. And Jesus is observing the Passover. Now, remember last week we talked about how when the Israelites came out of Egypt, the last plague was that the angel passed over, and the firstborn in every household died unless they had put the lamb's blood on the door, and then the angel passed over that door. And so they have this celebration called the Passover that they still celebrate to this day. It's a huge deal. And Jesus is celebrating this with his disciples. And they have what comes to be known as the Last Supper. So this is right before Jesus is going to die. And he says that the bread, he has them take the bread, and he says, this represents my body, which is going to be given for you as a sacrifice. Has them take the wine. This is my blood that is going to be poured out for you. And so this is what we are celebrating when we celebrate communion. Every week we're participating in this Last Supper with Jesus. Now, obviously, again, we're skipping over a whole lot of stuff to try and kind of get through this, but the next big thing in this road to his death is Gethsemane, okay? Now, Gethsemane is Jesus and Peter, James, and John, and they go out into the garden, and Jesus is doing something that we wouldn't necessarily think of from Jesus. He's agonized. And we get to see a picture where Jesus is showing us, because Jesus leads by example. And Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is showing us what it looks like when God calls you to something that you really don't want to do. And he says, God, if there is any other way for this to be done, I would actually really like that. But not my will, but your will be done. Now, Jesus is God. Him and the Father are one, so it's not like they're actually arguing about this. What Jesus is doing is showing us how we are to approach the things that we really don't want to do, but we know they're God's will. You can be honest and say, God, I don't want to do this. This does not look like fun, and I'm not looking forward to it. But ultimately, your will is what needs to be done and not mine. And this is kind of this scene in Gethsemane. It's really a sad scene because Jesus is grieving and again agonized. His sweat becomes like drops of blood, and I mean this is real raw emotion. And while he's going through this, Peter, James, and John, his inner circle, his closest apostles, they keep falling asleep, and every time he comes back, they're asleep again. And you got to kind of, I mean, at the risk of reading things into things, like, this just seems like it would be really, like, if you're already agonizing and you're already frustrated, to have your friends literally falling asleep while that's going on. This is a rough moment for Jesus, and so this is one of those examples when we can look and again see how Jesus leads us through this. So not too long after this, Jesus is arrested. The chief priests and elders send a group to come and arrest Jesus. Judas is to kiss him. That's the sign, and so Judas literally betrays him by kissing him. Now, this is where things take an interesting turn, because remember we talked about how the hope for the Messiah was that he was going to come and he was going to lead them to freedom. And so that meant leading them out of the control of the Romans. And so even though Jesus has been saying things that don't suggest this all along, there's still this belief within the disciples that eventually Jesus is going to lead a big rebellion and knock the Romans out. And there are people who think actually that Judas was even just trying to kind of nudge this along. But supposedly, that's what Jesus is going to be doing. And so when they come to arrest him, the disciples think it's go time. Like, this is fine. Like, we believed that he's the Messiah, and we're right, and now this is actually going to come to pass. Peter draws his sword and cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant, and Jesus rebukes him and tells him not to do that. He who lives by the sword will die by the sword, puts the ear back on and heals the man, and then is taken away. And now the disciples don't know what's going on because this doesn't make any sense. Jesus is not doing what they thought he was going to do. Nothing is happening the way that they thought it was going to happen, and they all run away, which was prophesied would happen, but is still, again, really sad. So Peter and John follow behind, and we're told that Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times, which Jesus had already said he was going to do. And Luke tells us that when he denies Jesus for the 3rd time, they make eye contact. And then Peter goes out and weeps bitterly. And I picture Peter kind of in a fetal position, just shaking, because he's so emotional over this terrible thing that he's done in betraying Jesus, even when he already knew that was going to happen, and he insists, no, I'm not going to do that, and he does it anyway. The trial that Jesus goes through is really you'd kind of have to have it in air quotes, like it's a trial. It's not legal, it's not done properly, it's pretty bogus, I guess would be the short way to say it. So Jesus goes before Annas and Caiaphas, the high priest. He goes before Pilate, goes before Herod, and then goes back before Pilate again. And Pilate is kind of the Roman procurator, kind of the leader guy at this time of the area. And he actually doesn't want to crucify Jesus, because that's what they're asking for, is for him to be crucified, which is a really, really, really horrible form of execution that we'll talk about in a minute. But this is what they want. The people, they want, and the religious leaders, they want Jesus crucified, and Pilate doesn't want to do it. They have this custom of releasing a prisoner, and because of the holiday, and he wants to do that, and they say, no, we want Barabbas, and Barabbas was an awful guy. Why they wanted him released makes absolutely no sense, but they're beyond reason, really, at this point. We just want Jesus to go away. It's time. And so Jesus is being tried, and the charge that the religious leaders are mainly trying to bring against him, among all these other crazy things, is that he's claiming to be God, which is blasphemy for a person to claim to be God. And this is actually important. So the question that we could ask, did Jesus claim to be God? And the reason that this is important, well, one reason that this is important, is skeptics talk a lot about how Jesus didn't necessarily claim to be God. They'll say that was something that was kind of given to him by his followers later, but that Jesus himself didn't actually consider himself to be God. And so we're looking here, this is what he's going to get crucified for. So if we're ever going to know what Jesus' stance on this actually is, this is where we're going to see it. Now, really quickly, there's a phrase in the Old Testament that Daniel uses that's called the Son of Man. And in Daniel chapter 7, we see this specific Son of Man. Now, look at some of the terms that are used here. So Daniel 7:13 says, "The Son of Man is equal with God and is seen coming with the clouds of heaven." Okay, and that's a Messiah passage, huge deal. Every religious leader would have known this. The Son of Man. Now, Jesus constantly refers to himself as the Son of Man. And in this specific instance where he is being tried, here in Mark 14, it says, "Again the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?' 'I am,' said Jesus, 'and you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven.'" So this is about as blatant a claim to be God as you could possibly get. Like, not only does he say, "I am," but then he throws an Old Testament passage that everyone would have known in there just to drive it home. So yes, Jesus does claim to be God, and it doesn't fare well for him. And so Jesus, Pilate cannot talk the people out of it. And so rather than have a riot or an uprising, he agrees reluctantly to have Jesus crucified. The death of Jesus, again, Pilate wants to release Jesus, but the people want Barabbas, which is psychotic, but it's where we are, okay? So the execution of Jesus, the first thing that Jesus would have gone through in dealing with all of this would have been a scourging. And this wasn't something that we talked about a whole lot before the Passion of the Christ came out. But now if you've seen the Passion of the Christ, you know that was part of it. And the scourging was a really, really, really brutal beating that a lot of prisoners didn't even survive. And it involved these whips that had pieces of bone or rocks or stuff like that, really sharp things that would just cut into your back. I mean, a horrible and bloody thing that started. And so when it says they took him and scourged him, we kind of, we read that and keep moving, but it was horrible, okay? The scourging was an awful thing. So Jesus is enduring all sorts of physical agony throughout this process. He's been beaten. His flesh is torn open. He's having to carry this cross to where they're gonna kill him. And then when he finally gets there, as if his body hasn't been through enough, now we're gonna actually do the crucifixion. And crucifixion was such a terrible means of execution that's where we get our word excruciating from. It actually led to its own word in inflicting pain. It was a horrible way to die, and it was reserved for lowest in society. It was reserved for criminals. You were put up on the cross naked, so it was humiliating. And then it was just a really painful way to die. So we're looking at nails in the wrists and nails through the ankles that are putting you up on the cross. And so pretend my other arm is out. So you're up on the cross. The main way, from what we understand about crucifixion, the main way that people died when they were crucified was actually by asphyxiation, which is an inability to breathe. So what would happen is, as you're up on the cross and you're on these nails, obviously as you get tired and it hurts, you start to sink. And the only way to breathe is to push on the nails and raise yourself up, which is also scratching your torn open back on the wooden cross. Take a breath and then sink back down. And you have to do that every time you want to take a breath. And eventually you get to the point where breathing is just not worth the effort, and you stop and you die. And so this is what Jesus is going through as he's being crucified. Now, the last thing that Jesus endures that really is the kicker, so to speak, because lots of people have been crucified. Even some of the apostles were crucified. And so, yes, as awful as crucifixion is, I mean, you could look at that and be like, well, I mean, other people have done this too. And so what makes Jesus any different than any of theirs. And Jesus has, on top of all of this, the weight of the sin of the world on him, because he's taking all of our sins. Now think about when you have done something wrong, and the weight of that, what that can be like on you. Jesus has the weight of all sin on him. It's a suffering that I can't really explain. I can't really understand. I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful Jesus was willing to do it, but it's a pretty intense thing to think about. The weight of sin, the quote there at the bottom of the slide, the blood of Jesus, his son, purifies us from all sin. That's from 1 John, and that's literally the salvation that we have. Jesus was willing to endure this and take all of the weight of our sin onto himself, and it's crazy. And Jesus eventually dies and is buried. But Jesus has this really annoying habit of not staying dead. And so Jesus died, and everybody knows that he died, because nobody survives a Roman crucifixion. You'll read that sometimes, like Jesus survived the cross. There is no record anywhere of anyone ever surviving a crucifixion. Romans were pretty good at killing people. And so Jesus died. And we have him being placed in a tomb, and he's not going to stay there. Now, with the resurrection of Jesus is an insanely huge deal, because it's kind of the linchpin for everything, so to speak. Paul says in 1 Corinthians that if Jesus did not raise from the dead, then our preaching is in vain. None of this makes any sense. Jesus is not who he said he was, and none of this matters. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, then that changes everything, because that means that Jesus is who he said he was, did what he said he was going to do, and we're going to be accountable to him in the ways that he said we would be. And so if Jesus rose from the dead, that is a big deal. And so people like to look at the crucifixion, or the resurrection, I mean. There are so many details regarding this, and all four Gospels end on this note with Jesus rising from the dead. And so we have some different versions of things. So when we think about what this means, I want to just kind of give you sort of a made-up example. So let's say that we're in here and we're having a class, and everyone loves Introduction to the Bible, so it's packed. There are all sorts of people. And all of a sudden, while the class is going on, Les runs in and starts throwing water balloons at people. And we know he's wearing a tie, and he's throwing water balloons. And I don't know which is weirder, because Les hates being wet and Les hates wearing a tie. So none of it really makes sense. And so when Sarah finds out that Les did this crazy thing, she wants to find out more information, maybe figure out what happened. So she's talking to people that were there. And the first person that she talks to says, yeah, Les ran in, he was wearing a red tie, and he threw 5 balloons. And the second person that she talks to runs in and says, yeah, he was wearing an orange tie, and he threw 4 balloons. And the third person that she talks to says, yeah, he ran in, he was wearing a yellow tie, and he threw 3 balloons. Now, is Sarah going to hear that and go, you know what, the details of this story are not adding up? I don't think it happened. Well, no, clearly Les ran into the room. Clearly Les was wearing a tie, and clearly Les hit people with water balloons. Like, even though some of these details are differing, there's no doubt that some of the stuff happened. And so looking at the resurrection, first questions in the resurrection, these are things that people ask because the details maybe are a little different from account to account. And so we wonder what that means. And we have stuff like which women were there? Some Gospels mention some women, some Gospels mention other women. Does it mean they went in a group and maybe there are some of them are mentioned here, some of them are mentioned there? What does that mean? Which women were there? Who rolled the stone away? Okay. Was it one angel or two? Some say one, some say two. How did the women respond? At one point, the women are afraid and they run away. At one point, they're delivering the news that they're supposed to. How did the women respond? How did the disciples respond? Did they run to the tomb? Were they excited? Were they doubtful? Different cases include different information, and we could look at some of these little details and the way that it's presented differently in some of the gospel accounts and be like, man, like what's the deal there? We see little bitty things here, and you can figure out what a lot of the differences are, but it's worth noting that those questions get asked. But what are our certainties in the resurrection? What does everyone agree took place in every account? And the first one, Jesus rose from the dead. No one disagrees about that. Everyone says Jesus rose from the dead. Everyone says that the women were the first ones to see him. And that's a huge deal because as awful as it sounds, women were not even allowed to testify in court back then. So if you were going to make up a story about something happening, you wouldn't want women to be the first people to see it. But everyone agrees that the women saw him first. Everyone agrees that the announcement was made by an angel. There's not an account where someone shows up and it's written on a sign, like Jesus out to lunch or something like that. Everyone agrees that the announcement came from an angel, and everyone agrees that the stone was somehow rolled away. He never walks through it. He never just appears on the other side. In every account, the stone gets rolled away. And so it's pretty clear that there are things we can be absolutely certain happened, and then we can base our rationalizations of the other things off that bedrock of truth. And so Jesus, if you think about it, and this is huge. Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, and they claimed that he rose from the dead in Jerusalem. Christianity, which is the religion that believes that Jesus did rise from the dead, started in Jerusalem. So if this is the city where Jesus literally was crucified, and you're going around telling people that he is actually alive and up walking around, one of two things is going to happen. Either it's not true and people are going to see through it really quickly and it's going to die, or it is true and people are going to experience it and it's going to explode. Historically speaking, the second one is what happened. So I can't show you, I don't have a video of Jesus walking out of the tomb that proves that he rose from the dead. But I do know that in the very town where he was executed, a whole lot of people instantly believed that he was alive again. And there's not really a great explanation for that beyond that they saw him, and it was true. And so Jesus has risen from the dead. He appears to his disciples, and then eventually we see him, and we see this at the end of Matthew, give this great, what we call the Great Commission, where he tells them that they're going to be his witnesses in the world, and then he goes up to heaven, and we get ready to start the church, which is the story that you and I are still a part of today. So the summary of what we see here in Jesus, John chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, "For God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. So what we see is this story has been going on since the very beginning, that God has had this plan, that he's going to bring Jesus, and he's going to be our sacrifice, and Jesus executed that plan to a T. And now he's died, he's come back from the dead, he has ascended to heaven, and we're going to start his church here on the earth, and that's what we're going to see next week. So let me look and see if anybody... Oh, now. Somebody said, get that hat off. No questions, though. So we're gonna pray. I want to thank you for being with me in this class. So one more week. Next week we finish it up, and so I appreciate you doing this with me. Let's pray. God, we love you. We know that we have no hope without Jesus. We have no life without Jesus. We have no salvation without Jesus. We thank you that we, on the other side of history, can look back and see how you were just working over and over and over again to set things up the way you wanted. And we thank you that that is something we can see and kind of hold on to. And we thank you that Jesus came and lived and taught us how to live, and also showed us how to be humble and to seek after you, and to even die in order to help others. And we thank you so much for that. And I pray as we finish tonight, and as we talk about the church next week and the start of the church, which is our story as well, I pray that you'll help us to have the hearts and minds we need to hear what you want us to say, or to hear what you would want us to hear. We love you, and we thank you so much for everything. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, thank you guys for watching. Have a wonderful night.